Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents History Has Begun, The Birth of a New America by Bruno Maçães. Narrated by David Marantz. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Preface. We are unlearning old truths, a prelude to learning new ones. The values that have guided Western politics for decades or even centuries still seem true to most of us in the West, but they are true in a different way. They no longer seem inevitable. They may triumph in the end, but the playing field has been leveled. There are no impersonal forces pushing everyone towards the happy end of a society like those existing in North America or the European Union. In this new world, no triumph is ever definitive, which is to say that no triumph is ever a triumph. The future is open. We are about to become the first human type to live entirely in history. Like human beings over the past 3 or 4 centuries, we live predominantly in the future and for the sake of the future. We are aware that nothing is permanent. Unlike our predecessors, we no longer believe that historical change has a meaning and direction. We are revolutionaries who have lost the faith in revolution. For the moment, Western values seem in retreat. They are certainly not advancing, much less being irresistibly carried to every corner of the earth. That we used to believe in their automatic expansion seems almost incredible now, but that does not mean that the situation has become hopeless. History does not take sides. It has not chosen liberal values, but neither has it chosen a new challenger. There is an implicit call here to join the battle, and that is the element in our predicament that is simultaneously unnerving and exciting. So far, the challenge to the old truths has come from the usual suspects. Almost as if the Soviet Union had never collapsed, the loudest voices in Russia continue to argue that what the West calls paradise is, when properly observed, the very idea of hell. It is a cry in the wilderness that never rises above a lonely cry, because when it comes to the decisive task of creation, Russia has failed, or at least fallen short. Those who cannot live by the ruling values but are equally unable to produce new ones may justly be accused of having failed at the game. China is a different case. This is a country that shows no evidence on converging with Western society on political and economic values, but whose ability to compete with the West seems undisputed. Whether the Chinese economy continues on the same path of fast growth or enters a period of malaise, few with knowledge of local realities will doubt its ability to master the sources of technological growth. It is precisely on this question that contemporary China has issued a serious challenge to liberal ideas. If China is able to demonstrate that Western society is not the only model capable of developing and controlling the key technologies of the future, global political competition will take place between different models, and historical development will no longer follow a predetermined path. At that point, nothing will allow us to think that other major powers, such as India, cannot in the future look for their own political models in independence from existing alternatives. I wrote about this possibility in previous books before realizing that a much bigger question has been strangely neglected. Might not the challenge to the ruling values come from inside the system rather than outside? I do not mean to say that a country such as the United States could enter a political crisis or even a process of institutional decline. That possibility is being discussed today. Many commentators see copious evidence of it and openly appeal to other societies to carry the liberal torch while Americans pass through their political distempers. But no political crisis, no matter how serious or prolonged, would provide much of a challenge to the dominant political values. In the absence of an alternative, even collapse would leave those values intact, waiting for a return or rebirth at the appropriate moment. Those who have spoken of liberal society as the final political model for mankind had their sights on the cunning of history, the influence of larger forces of which men and women may not be fully aware. There is room in this narrative for errors and catastrophes, crises and convulsions. The triumphal march of liberal democracy has been prodigal in setbacks. For the United States to actively challenge the very values upon which it was founded, something else is needed. Not a process of collapse, but an act of reinvention. I wrote in a previous book, the United States may yet reveal itself as a shapeshifter. This prodigious child of the Enlightenment might not hesitate to shed Western liberal principles if it becomes convinced that they have been refuted by time and experience. If ever the United States becomes convinced that the West belongs to the past, it could leave Europe living in that past, but it will not be inclined to remain there itself, especially if that would entail sacrificing the thing to which it is most addicted, global primacy. If the West ever falters, America will want to become less Western. As the fulcrum of world power moves away from the West, so will America. At first glance, it is possible to think that the country at the center of the existing world order will also be the most conservative element in the system. It benefits from the system in greater measure, and it likely has a sharper understanding of the organizing values. On the other hand, the center of global power is free of the temptations to please and emulate. As for intuitive knowledge of the organizing values, might it not be the case that those who understand their appeal are also better positioned to discover their contradictions and to believe that they can overcome them? In contrast to the generalized attack against liberalism being conducted in China, the reinvention happening in America is natural and spontaneous. It may be more difficult to perceive because it has evolved from within the liberal idea. Even when it departs from liberalism, it does so more often than not in response to its inner limits and contradictions. If a new world is being born, it is doing so slowly and almost imperceptibly. In the game of civilization, much like in chess, one must move a piece at a time, keeping all others in place until a new combination emerges. The question with which this book opens thus finds a precise answer. The current moment in American history is both a moment of destruction and a moment of creation. It is a moment of destruction if one considers the values inherited from modern European culture and strongly affirmed during the first century of the Republic, when the United States stood practically as a European colony. It is a moment of creation if one looks to more recent decades and attempts to project the transformations they announce into the immediate future. This book is an attempt to examine the subtle processes by which a new way of looking at the world slowly extends to every facet of individual and collective life. I opt to call this way of looking a civilization in order to express how different cultural, social, and political elements form a coherent whole. My second and comparatively more ambitious task is to attempt to decipher the logic of this new civilization. It is apparent that, in a way analogous to the core European civilization from which it descends, contemporary America is organized around a powerful ideal of individual freedom and creativity, but the way freedom is understood and expressed now differs rather dramatically on both sides of the Atlantic. The transatlantic world is not static, but exists in time, from the origins of the modern sensibility and the birth of liberalism in Europe to a decidedly postmodern and post-liberal experiment in America. At a time when the nature of transatlantic relations is feverishly discussed, amid much anxiety about their vitality or even survival, we would do well to inject them with the pathos of history and change. E leads to A rather than E equals A. Europe and America are not the same. They do not exist in a relation of identity, but they are deeply connected. They follow from each other, and in the process issue a challenge to each other. America can thrive as an outgrowth of European civilization only to the extent that it offers a solution to its outstanding and deeply felt contradictions. If it succeeds, American civilization will turn out to be something completely original, and this, as Kaiserling would say, is the best that could be said of it. What the world wants is the creation of new values. Repetition, even of the best, is contrary to the law of life. The novelist and critic Waldo Frank argued in a book published in 1940 that just as 1,000 years ago Europe knew a bloom from which 10 centuries and America itself issued, so the United States of his time was experiencing the chaos and the blindness, the dynamic impulse and the rightness of youth. The collapse of the old world was approaching, and America would finally have the chance to create a new one. Frank had the intuition of a beginning, but no sense yet of what this new world would look like. Though the epoch was American, the period was still European. It is up to us to provide a new picture. What is this American civilization about? What values does it hold? Conventional wisdom suggests that the United States has already reached its peak. But what if it is only now starting to forge its own path forward? What if American history is only just beginning? The following traces the story of the new America from its mysterious first apparitions to the present convulsions. Angkor, September 2019. As this book was being launched in the United Kingdom, the coronavirus crisis was declared a pandemic. The United States was quickly engulfed by a chaotic succession of events, surprising observers accustomed to seeing in America a beacon of state capacity and global guidance. In an obvious way, the pandemic provided the natural conclusion to my argument. A country built on the promise of fantasy was now facing reality in its purest form. Viruses are not even properly alive, being closer to biological chemicals. How would America react? Would its flight from reality come to a premature end? I chose to answer these questions in a new chapter. The addition ruins my veiled allusion to the 7 days it took to build America, but that is perhaps appropriate. One of my main theses is that no process is ever finished. There is nothing old under the sun. Istanbul, March 2020. 1. In 1836, the American landscape painter Thomas Cole completed an ambitious 5-canvas historical allegory titled The Course of Empire. Today, the series is something of an internet sensation, even if art critics will point out its imitative or naive elements. It is graphic, spectacular, and pungent, and carries a simple political message. Nations go through stages similar to an individual life. They are born, they grow and prosper, but inevitably decay sets in. Or is it the pictures that got smaller? Death and destruction must follow. The series begins with The Savage State, a painting of nature untouched by human activity. A hunter clad in skins pursues a deer, while in the distance a cluster of primitive tents around a fire prefigures the city to be. The emergence of an agrarian civilization from this early tribe of hunters is the theme of the second painting, The Arcadian or Pastoral State. In The Consumption of Empire, the third painting, we reach the apex of civilization. The scene looks garish and tasteless, but perhaps it is always like that with culture at its moment of fullest expression. Human figures fill every empty space, and there is a whirl of excitement as an imperial procession crosses a bridge and leaves the scene on the left through a pink and golden arch. Opulence reigns, the architecture is excessive, and everything is finished and perfect. Bright white marble covers every available surface. There is nothing left to achieve, and one fears for civil peace when contemplating the excited mobs elbowing their way. nature follows the rhythms of empire. The first painting depicts the city at dawn, probably in spring, the second on a morning in early summer, the third at noon during a hot summer day. The fourth painting, Destruction, is dark, dramatic, sublime. The scene is the sack and destruction of the city. An enemy fleet has sailed up the river, setting fire to the buildings and killing and raping the inhabitants. One has to conclude that their task was made easier by the state of luxury and laziness in which they found the city. There are contorted corpses everywhere, and those trying to flee have improvised a wooden structure to cross the same bridge, now broken, which in the previous painting signified power and triumph. It is difficult to tell whether the dark clouds above result from the burning buildings or the storm raging beyond. Finally, in the last painting of the series, Desolation, a long and final night has descended upon the city, where not a living soul appears, and only the grandiose ruins of the past distinguish the scene from the beginning of the narrative. Nature is returning. New trees, bushes, and ivy already cover many of the crumbling buildings, natural ruins drained of human energy. The lonely column in the foreground is a nesting place for birds. The course of empire must be interpreted in the context of the social and political changes brought about by the presidency of Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States, whose portrait now occupies a place of honor in Donald Trump's Oval Office. Jackson seemed to combine the worst tendencies of democracy and mob rule with imperious autocracy. To a certain patrician class of Americans, it must have seemed that the end was nigh. Suddenly the masses felt confident in their own power, and an unprecedented expansion in credit led to rampant speculation and the threat of a financial collapse. What made conservatives uneasy about the new America was the erosion of moral, social, and institutional restraints on individual self-interest. The bubble did eventually burst in 1837, the first of many large financial crises through which the United States climbed its way to the top of the global economy. A contemporary noted in his account of the crisis, "In 1835 the madness made further progress and continued increasing up to 1836 in July, when it reached its height." Was America under Andrew Jackson reaching its final stage? To many it may have seemed that way, but we now know that it had barely reached the stage of an agrarian economy, while large swaths of future territory remained images of savage nature. And in fact, for most Americans, the paintings were supposed to represent the stories of ancient lands, not a lesson for their own time. Cole's contemporaries had stopped believing in history as a cycle of birth and death. For many, the greatest threat to America was not the growth of democracy, but the fact that it had yet to fulfill its promise. This was a narrative of progress and the hope in its future realization. They remembered Jefferson's forebodings about slavery. And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with his wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. On the surface, it is Rome that the course of empire represents. The Roman Republic had been the model for the new American Republic, and its dissolution appeared to the first 2 or 3 generations of Americans as the fate against which they had to guard themselves. Like the Romans, Americans had risen up and expelled their kings. They now lived in dread that the Republic might succumb to internal corruption. In the image of the emperor sustained by a submissive and stupefied populace, Cole was evoking a common perception of Andrew Jackson. The narrative center of the series evoked common feelings of Republican danger fueled by the loss of public virtue. But the classical world was also the source for a certain way of looking at history, where nations are caught in an incessant cycle of rise and fall, defended by seminal political thinkers such as Plutarch and Polybius. Cole was obsessed by cyclical history, and in his later years explicitly predicted the downfall of American democracy at the close of the 20th century. In an unpublished science fiction tale, he describes a country whose population now numbers in the hundreds of millions. The landscape glitters with new cities and countless buildings, but material progress goes together with rampant corruption, irreligion, and anarchy. Human nature and the historical laws that it generated were everywhere the same. It was only a matter of time before the logic of these laws would catch up with and triumph over the exceptional conditions of American culture. Throughout his histories, the Greek historian Polybius tries to convey the lesson that when a nation departs from its founding principles, catastrophe is near at hand. When a state is growing in power, it needs to consider the feelings and thoughts of its neighbors. Pride and arrogance follow closely upon conquest, but they would never allow one to acquire empire, and therefore should be considered a very inadequate tool for holding it. Polybius frequently alludes to the fact that with expansion, Rome started to suffer from corruption, indolence, and luxury. Competition for wealth replaced competition for honor and distinction. When a state has warded off many serious threats and has come to attain undisputed supremacy and sovereignty, lifestyles become more extravagant, and rivalry over political positions and other such projects becomes fiercer than it should be. But was Polybius right? Rome survived for half a millennium beyond his death, and many of its greatest achievements came in later centuries. This is especially true if we consider those achievements that seem to us inspired by an original and creative Roman character rather than Greek wisdom and knowledge: the genius of Caesar, the conquest of Egypt, the Pantheon, the philosophy of Marcus Aurelius, the poetry of Virgil or Ovid. In the natural course of events, as Polybius sees it, the first political system to arise is monarchy, which is succeeded by kingship, where one person rules by consent, and then tyranny. Aristocracy necessarily degenerates into oligarchy, and when the general populace gets impassioned enough to seek redress for the crimes committed by their leaders, democracy is born. And in due course of time, once democracy turns to violating and breaking the law, mob rule arises and completes the series. Everything naturally goes through successive phases of growth, prime, and decline, and in every respect things are at their best during their prime. There is only one way to make the state last forever, and that is to bundle together all the merits and distinctive characteristics of the best systems of government, maintained in a high degree of balance. This is the natural course, but in the real world states do not simply decay and restart. They are conquered if too weak or if more powerful rivals grow in their neighborhood. Competition and not natural decay is the main reason to build a balanced political system. In that case, when a general threat from abroad forces citizens and classes to cooperate and collaborate, the state gains extraordinary abilities. Everyone works together in their public and private capacities to complete the task at hand. There is no contingency that it is incapable of meeting. This gives the Roman state its characteristic feature. It is irresistible and achieves every goal it sets itself. While in Carthage the common people had by then become the dominant political force, in Rome this was still the Senate. Since policy was decided in Carthage by the masses and in Rome by the best men, Roman policies would prevail. Polybius, a Greek exile and captive, is not in a position to claim that no state is immortal, but he has no illusions about that. He quotes the words of Scipio Aemilianus after the consul succeeded in finally entering Carthage and destroying the city, Rome's old rival for control of the Mediterranean. Scipio looked upon the ruins and reflected that all cities and nations, like human beings, must one day meet their doom. All the empires of Media, Persia, Macedonia, so brilliant in their time, had come to an end. Why should any later exemplar have a different fate? Old verses from Homer escaped his lips. A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish. When Polybius asked him what he meant by the verses, they say that without any attempt at concealment, he named his own country, for which he feared when he reflected on the fate of all things human. At the very moment of triumph, and disaster for his fiercest enemy, the young Roman statesman understood that Rome too would one day lie in ruins. In a book published in 2010, the legal scholar Bruce Ackerman argued against what he still saw as America's constitutional triumphalism. He regarded it as a sign of terminal decline. In the past, Americans were very reluctant to consider their constitutional system as perfect. They were too busy improving it. Ackerman worried that once triumphalism became dominant, the energy that had kept the American experiment going would disappear as well. Much of his analysis comes close to the way of thinking of classical historians such as Polybius. Every republic starts with a given capital of vitality. It will use it to face and overcome the crises that are a necessary part of political life, but in time, that capital will be depleted. Or to describe the dialectic in a different way, each successful attempt to solve a political or constitutional problem will create a new problem which will need to be solved in turn. And since many solutions do not even manage to address the underlying issue, problems keep multiplying, and the system keeps getting weaker when it should in fact need greater and greater resources. Ackerman does not blame the original system for the great constitutional crisis he sees coming. That system had at least been tested. It overcame many dangerous moments for the Constitution and the Republic. But the current political and constitutional system of the United States is almost unrecognizable. It was born of the very process by which the American Republic faced the challenges of the last 2 centuries. Ominously, every dangerous pathology Ackerman is able to find turns out to be relatively recent, and his fear is that we are approaching the moment when they will start to interact with each other, when all the pieces of a picture of decline, the course of empire, have been put in place. What does he predict, then? Firstly, that the presidential nomination system will produce an increasing number of outsiders elected because they have mobilized public opinion around extreme and unconventional programs. Secondly, presidents will increasingly rely on political polarization with extreme messages tailored to different micro-publics. Thirdly, they will rely on super-loyalists more than on the public bureaucracy, and they will look for new ways to use their executive powers over the military. Fourthly, they will appeal to national emergencies and specific mandates from the public to override constitutional procedures. Ackerman concludes that these are the dynamics for the decline and fall of the American Republic. Many of these points seem remarkably prescient. Both Obama and Trump have helped bring those possibilities closer to reality, but on one thing at least, Ackerman turned out to be wrong. He finished his book with the renewed concern that Americans had become too triumphant. The recognition that the American constitutional tradition is in serious trouble is entirely lacking at present. If anything, Americans are more prone to celebrate the eternal wisdom of the Founding Fathers than they were a generation ago. This may or may not have been true a decade ago, but since then we have entered a new period where the collective mood has embraced the narrative of decline, where the darkest gloom has descended upon Washington, and where Americans have become fixated on images of dictators, civil war, and the ruins of empire. Popular novels such as Tropic of Kansas and American War depict a plausible future where the United States has collapsed. A fascist president has been elected, killer drones patrol the skies, football stadiums have been turned into prisons, a second civil war has broken out, Texas is invaded by Mexico, and guerrillas ravage the land. Many contemporary commentators argue that American elites now regard their own country as spoils to be fought over. Currents over the past 4 decades express the relentless pursuit of private interest at the expense of the.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?